Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. On April 8th, 2024, North America will experience a total solar eclipse, which will pass over numerous states and countless locations, including the Indiana University campuses in Bloomington, Indianapolis, Kokomo, Richmond, and Columbus, Indiana. In collaboration with the IU Alumni Association, we are delighted to bring you a special six-part series about this astronomical phenomenon. Tonight's presentation will offer insights into IU's history with total solar eclipses. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce this evening's featured presenter from IU Libraries, Associate Librarian and Director of the Wylie House Museum, Carey Champion. In her capacity, Ms. Champion oversees the management of the historic house, its archival and object collections, as well as the Morton C. Bradley Jr. Education Center. Her scholarship focuses on innovative pedagogical methods for primary source instruction and advancing inclusive interpretation practices within heritage sites. Following her talk, Ms. Champion will be joined by art history undergraduate and Wylie House student worker Kaya Wells for the audience Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Closed captioning is also available. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Champion for her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I appreciate it. There we go. I want to make sure you're going to be able to hear some elements too. And speaking of hearing, the music that you were listening to as you entered this evening is an eclipse-inspired piece of music, a waltz from 1869. And I'll be sharing a few more of those with you throughout the presentation. So again, I am Carey Champion. And before we begin, I will be talking a lot about IU history and solar eclipses, but I want to first thank you all for being here and express my appreciation to the College of Arts and Science for this lovely invitation. It's been a great joy to spend a little time stepping back in time myself a little bit more than usual. I've been learning a lot about IU and eclipse history, so apologies now for any astronomers who are here who, for whom I may not get the scientific details correct. I'm both the director of Wylie Historic House Museum here at the Bloomington campus and a librarian for the IU libraries here. And like any decent librarian, this talk this evening has pulled from other experts. So much of my contact is from other librarians, archivists, and historians for whom I am really grateful that they did the work so that I could pull it together for you this evening. In particular, I would like to thank the work of IU historian and emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine, Jim Capshew, and one of his former students, PhD candidate Sarah Josina Reynolds, a former doctoral student who in 2017 did some fantastic digging into IU history, and I've learned a lot from them as well. So without further ado, let me share what I've learned. The waltz. So you may be asking yourself, why Wylie House Museum and eclipse history? What's the connection? Well, first, let me tell you about Wylie House Museum. It is part of IU Libraries. It's the 1835 home of the first president of IU, Andrew Wylie, and his younger cousin, IU Professor Theophilus Wylie. They were both avid astronomers. Their interest in astronomy is evident in the architecture of the home, the objects in our collection, and archival materials that inform the museum's history and our interpretation of it. If you've been here for a tour, in fact, you may have seen some of the objects that relate to our astronomical history here. We are, as I said, a unit of IU Libraries, and we have an academic mission. So teaching is part of what we do. We serve as a resource for IU classes, students, and researchers through those tours, instruction sessions. We're an archival repository, and we offer experiential learning opportunities for students. We are open to the public, and we interpret the home with period furnishings based on an interpretation based on those Wylie archival materials. So the connection is these men, Andrew Wylie and Theophilus Wylie. So for clarification, the museum was essentially saved and is named for the first president of IU, Andrew Wylie, but it's his younger cousin who holds a prominent place in IU history as a beloved professor who served as a chair of various departments, interim president on multiple occasions, vice president from 1882 to 84, and is also considered the first university librarian, and that's Theophilus Wylie, the Eclipse guy. And while they both enjoyed astronomy, both studied it, and in fact, some of President Wylie's first books that he had on hand as the new president of IU were listed as astronomy books. But it's Theophilus who was an earnest student, a contributing scientist, and a documenter of local astronomical phenomena. He was a prolific journaler. Decades worth of diary entries reference his observations, scientific observations that were mechanical and electrical in nature, daily weather observations, and regular astronomical and atmospheric observances. He also, in addition to being a professor, was a minister, and his even his sermons were often about science. He merged the two. He spoke regularly with groups around the state and the region. On your left, you'll see an astronomy lecture that he gave to the Teachers Institute in 1874. On your right, you see the cover of a journal to which he contributed, along with his colleague, Professor Daniel Kirkwood, his scientific observations on astronomy. And then in the middle, these are just clips from those decades worth of diary entries. Over and over again, he notes his astronomical observations, but also his great wonder and joy and astonishment in those observations. So when we talk about IU Eclipse history, of course, it spans up until the present. IU was established in 1820. But I wanted to reference first an eclipse that happened in this region prior to the establishment of the university, and one you may have heard of. I won't go into depth about it, but I want to make note of the 1806 total eclipse in northern Indiana territory. It's the land of the Shawnee and Chief Tecumseh. William Henry Harrison was the governor of the territory at the time. And that 1806 total eclipse was predicted by Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa. And there are numerous stories. It's worth doing a little Googling to learn about the impact the prediction had on the white colonizers and William Henry Harrison himself. We're going to jump then to 1869, and that's the eclipse for which we have the most information and the references from the Wylies. In 1878, IU expedition goes to Boulder to study that total eclipse. Again, in 1905, an expedition of IU professors traveled to Amazon, Spain, followed by another expedition to Colorado in 1918, and so forth. I believe the next one was 1932. but we'll stick to the 19th century this evening. So the last total eclipse visible in Bloomington, total coverage of the sun by the moon, occurred here in Bloomington and the IU campus on August 7th, 1869. And I thought I'd give you some context, again, relating Wylie House and those who lived here to those that eclipse and others. So as I mentioned, IU was established in 1820. Andrew Wylie becomes president here in 1829, builds a house, and the home has a widow's walk on it. Widow's walk is another name for a rooftop porch, and of course that's critical to astronomical observation. And then in 1859, Andrew Wylie has passed, his wife has passed, and his younger cousin, Theophilus Wylie, purchases the home, moves in with his family, and is able to take advantage of that incredible widow's walk on the top of the home. In 1869, that solar eclipse arrives, and only 9 years later, another solar eclipse is visible in North America, out in Colorado. And for those of you who are IU history buffs, you'll know that in 1883, campus moved to its current location, which means it was somewhere else before, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I wanted just to draw your attention, though, to a few other historical moments for IU that occurred during this time period. Only 2 years prior to that solar eclipse in 1869, the first woman attends IU is Sarah Park Morrison. And only a few years after that solar eclipse in 1878, the first Black man enters IU for 3 semesters. His name is Harvey Young, and both of them boarded at Wylie House with Theophilus and family. So if you've been to Wylie House before, you might know that it's situated off campus currently. It's a few blocks southwest of campus proper, but it didn't used to be. It used to be proximate to the original campus. And I thought I'd share a couple photos with you. When President Wylie was here initially from 1835 to his death in 1859, campus looked a lot like it looks over there on the left. And it was referred to as the seminary initially, before it became Indiana College and then eventually Indiana University. As the campus grows and Theophilus is interim president, vice president, and a leading professor, the campus begins to look like the image on your right. And this is where, if we think about Professor Theophilus Wylie and his colleagues who were so invested in the study of astronomy, we can imagine them there on that campus. In fact, on the right in that science building. Here's Theophilus Wylie, in fact, in a classroom inside that science hall. He was a professor of languages, natural philosophy, mechanics, physics, and astronomy, essentially a Renaissance man, like so many of them were. I love this photograph because if I were to imagine what a 19th century science classroom would look like, it would be, in fact, this. Some of his colleagues at the time, and names you might recognize, are Professor Richard Owen Hall, a geologist, natural scientist, Professor David Starr Jordan, ichthyologist, zoologist, Alicia Ballantyne, math and languages professor, and Daniel Kirkwood, mathematics and astronomy. These were his colleagues and also his friends. So Bloomington wasn't the only Hoosier college town that the 1869 eclipse passed through. Other towns included Terre Haute and Evansville. Up north of us, DePauw University in Greencastle. And this was the trajectory through which the total eclipse passed. As a side note, the Earth's next total eclipse will be on August 12th, 2026. It can be viewed in Iceland or Spain if you'd like to travel there. The next one to be viewed in North America is in 2044, and the next total eclipse here over Bloomington in Indiana will be viewed in 2153, I suppose is how we say that. So just like now, the eclipse in 1869 was quite the event. And viewing parties were planned, including here at Wylie House. In 1869, on August 7th, Professor Wylie, Theophilus Wylie that is, organized a solar eclipse viewing on the roof of this residence, Wylie House. He and his family had been in the home for 10 years by then. This photograph has been scrutinized over and over by many people. Professor Theophilus Wylie writes extensively about that day, August 7th, 1869, and about inviting people to be on his roof, and also his attempts to capture the day and the event with his camera. He was an early camera owner. He built his own cameras, and it was a scientific invention that he was particularly enamored with. So we have many photos, fortunately, because of his passion and interest. And so he writes of the eclipse day and of inviting so many people up on the roof. And this is the earliest photograph we have of the museum. It's from the back of the home from the north side, and it's quite possible, perhaps even probable, that it was taken on the morning of August 7th, 1869. Folks that were there that day that he invited included some of those professors I mentioned earlier. Professor Elijah Ballantyne, Professor Daniel Kirkwood, and another name you might be familiar with if you're an IU alum, Foster, Colonel John Foster. In addition to those gentlemen, Theophilus' son Brown was present, we know, as well as a local photographer, J.B. Allison, all of whom are mentioned in his notebooks, diaries. You'll also note that there are some women on the house, and I'll give you a close-up view of the folks up there in just a moment. Sorry about that. You get to gallop to the next slide with me. So that rooftop porch, that Widow's Walk, we have a few photographs from the top of it. And to situate you a little bit more clearly, I thought I'd give you a sense of what the area looked like in 1885. Of course, this is several years after 1869, so possibly it was even more rural during that solar eclipse that year. But if you're standing on this picture was taken from the top of the house, from that Widow's Walk, facing southwest towards campus. So the view is from the roof, looking down East 2nd Street here in Bloomington. And that red circle at the upper left is the first university building, sometimes referred to as the first college building. It was the building you saw earlier that was on the left, the tall one, on Old Seminary Square campus. So you can see from the house, the Wylies would just be able to walk down that dirt road and be at work for the day. So again, our solar eclipse viewing party guests, Professor Ballantyne, Kirkwood, and Colonel Foster. And Colonel Foster was an IU alum and played some leading roles in the governance of Indiana. Again, others mentioned include Theophilus' son Brown, also professor at IU, and the local photographer. And you'll note those women there to the right. You also note that some of those gentlemen have climbed over the railing and are on the top of the roof. And while we do occasionally take some folks to the top of the roof, we don't ever allow that. We can't recreate the photo. But the women up there, we believe we can identify Theophilus' wife, Rebecca. She would be the woman on the far right. Next to her would be her sister, Aunt Emma Dennis. And then further to the right, it looks like another woman, and we can't quite identify her, but we have some thoughts, and I'll share that with you in just a moment. Oh, I just wanted to mention, in case you're not familiar and you're not an alum, that these names are are professors who were not only prominent leaders, but for whom, like many campuses, there are buildings named after them, local streets are named after them. So these are familiar folks to us. Daniel Kirkwood, in particular, as an astronomer, holds a special place in this history. And astronomy in the 19th century at IU and in other places of higher ed was considered a branch of mathematics. So these professors, when I mentioned that they were mathematics professors, they were also often studying astronomy. And the languages also crossed over into these studies as well, these histories, using Latin and Greek to understand what they're learning of the past in astronomy. So as for speculation about who that other woman might be up on the roof, it could, in fact, have been this woman, Elizabeth, known as Lizzie Breckenridge. Lizzie lived and worked as a paid domestic servant in the Wylie home for more than 50 years. Theophilus Wylie taught her astronomy and became a topic of great interest to her. In fact, while we don't know much about her, it's one of the things we know for certain is that she was deeply invested in the study of the stars and that Theophilus taught her. And in fact, that she owned a copy of this book that you see in the center of your page, Easy Star Lessons, and probably several others as well. So that day, on August 7th, the viewing party gathered, including those professors and those women, and who knows how long they stayed out there, what they saw, maybe they dispersed and went elsewhere. But Theophilus wrote about it the next day, and here's what he tells us. He starts his entry with, yesterday, witnessed the total eclipse of the sun, a most magnificent sight. And he goes on to say, the corona splendid, radiated, extending on an average about 1/4 diameter of the moon's disk all around. On the lower limb and northern or night limb, there were tufts of flames shining with brilliancy. The light of sun reappeared as a point of dazzling brilliancy on the right limb of the sun. The birds flitted about alarmed. The cocks crowed. Noticed a bat flying about. The whole landscape had an unearthly, unnatural aspect. Did not notice the duration of the totality, but it seemed to be about a minute. He goes on, and in referencing his colleague, the local photographer, he says, had been engaged with Allison, endeavoring to photograph the sun. But when the totality came on, we both broke and ran to see it and let the important moment pass. We had taken several photos during the progress of the eclipse, but I fear they do not amount to much. The eclipse terminated exactly by my watch at 1600 hours, 19 minutes, began about 4:20. In preparation for the eclipse, I had nearly run myself and Brown down, made a contrivance, and he sketched it. This is the image you're seeing on your screen. Made a contrivance to attach to the telescope for taking the pictures. Cleaned the fixings, remounted the telescope in the garret window. Friday being cloudy, could not try experiments. And then again, he mentions Professor Valentine and Kirkwood, Colonel Foster, Mr. Lee of Charleston witnessed the eclipse from the top of our house. This entry became even more interesting to me when I attended some trainings this past summer through the College of Arts and Sciences. And I learned from astronomical photographers that one of the most important things to do is to be prepared to take your photograph of the eclipse remotely, because you don't want to miss the actual occurrence yourself. And it made this entry by Theophilus ring that much more true, that he was so taken with it, the eclipse that day, that he forgot to take the photo. We're going to move on. We're going to poke it into our next slide. And I want you to imagine, you know, that day in 1869, what that must have been like. to be here in Bloomington on campus as student or as a local community member in this rare once in a lifetime opportunity, this great celestial phenomena. There are very few other references, local personal accounts of the eclipse in 1869. But among the collections at our County History Center, there is a handwritten note. It describes the experience, and it's similar to Theophilus's description of its unearthly, unnatural aspect. And this local county resident writes, "The sun was no more than a sickle of light, burning, a vast and glorious new moon, and an earthly pallor began to shroud the world. Suddenly, it was night, a night presaging disaster and the end of the world." That's why we needed a little polka to lighten things up. Moving on from 1869. 9 years later, a 67-year-old Wylie and his wife Rebecca traveled by train and carriage to Boulder, Colorado. He was intent to see the solar eclipse once again, and he joined thousands of others that were present in that area outside of Boulder to witness this other complete solar eclipse. There, Theophilus joined a former IU student named Charles Campbell, whose father was also professor at IU. Wylie reported that their climb together up a mountain outside Boulder that warm July day was incredibly difficult, but that at the top they had a fine view, both of the mountain peaks and of the valley below them. In a letter home to his daughter, Theophilus wrote that during the eclipse, the corona was much brighter than what he'd seen in August of 1869 in Bloomington. The sky was perfectly clear, the corona exceedingly brilliant. He could hardly believe it was not the sun itself. Some birds flew about, seemingly not knowing what to do. And he also witnessed something, a phenomenon known as Bailey's beads, which some of you may be familiar with. Those are the points of light that can appear along the edge of the moon as it moves in and out of totality. This effect occurs when gaps in the moon's rugged terrain allow the sunlight to pass through in some places just before the total phase of the eclipse along those edges. What you're seeing here on your screen are sketches that Theophilus did of them in his notebook. And he wrote that he first noticed the first points of light up there at point A, the top right of this, the eclipse drawing he has in that top figure. Notice the first light at A in the form of points of light. They were plainly visible, 6 or 7 of these, and for each a radiation such as it is seen around a small hole when the sun is seen directly through it. And below, again, he has the top right area of the eclipse with those dazzling points of light, those Bailey's beads that he's viewing. Well, despite those additional details and the brilliance he observed that day, he adds in his letter that it was a magnificent sight, though it did not impress me as much as the eclipse of 1869. The darkness was not near so great. So better in Bloomington. This is Maria Mitchell. She was an astronomer, and Theophilus met her on his trip out to Colorado in that 1878 July eclipse expedition. He also met Thomas Edison, whom he describes as, quote, the greatest curiosity, unquote. And he says no more, so we'll never know what he meant. But Maria Mitchell was there, and she was known to him. She had international fame, in fact, as an astronomer. Among her other many accomplishments, she was the first woman hired by the federal government in a specialized non-domestic role. Her title was Computer of Venus. She performed complex celestial calculations to help sailors navigate the globe, and she'd been doing that for many years. She grew up in Nantucket and learned astronomy and mathematics from her father, and was working there before she was hired by the federal government. And you may know of her, she was the first person to discover a telescopic comet in 1847, for which she earned international fame and a gold medal. Many other things. Vassar College started with her at the helm, and an observatory was built there for her. And so not only did she go herself to Boulder that summer where she met Theophilus, but she also brought a team of female students from Vassar College to observe that solar eclipse. The photo on the bottom is them there out in what we can imagine was a valley outside of Boulder. Well, Theophilus and his colleague, astronomy professor Daniel Kirkwood, contributed to several scientific magazines. They occasionally co-authored articles. Kirkwood is most well known for his contributions in the study of asteroid orbits. And here's where I don't understand it all, but I do want to share with you a little bit about Professor Kirkwood. There's an asteroid phenomenon with his name, Kirkwood gaps. When arranging the growing number of discovered asteroids by their distance from the sun at that time, Kirkwood noted several gaps, now named Kirkwood gaps, in his honor. And he was able to associate these gaps with orbital resonances with the orbit of Jupiter. In that 1878 eclipse, Professor Kirkwood was, of course, paying close attention to, and he wrote up a report for the Indiana School Journal to summarize the findings of astronomers during that eclipse. Among his observations, he shared the length of time that those Bailey beads remained visible to astronomers. Those very few seconds allowed them to calculate the height of those mountains around the moon's disk, reportedly 1.5 miles high. I haven't checked on that, but it's fascinating to me that they could calculate it by that. I think it was fascinating to Kirkwood too. The first thing that he reported on in this article for the Indiana School Journal was the major astronomical news of the time, and that was that a new planet had been observed by 2 major astronomers. They claimed they saw a planet closer to the sun than Mercury, an intramercurial planet. It was named Vulcan, and it actually remained a popular theory for decades. Professor Kirkwood, you'll be glad to know, was an early skeptic long before it was debunked and explained away by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Here's the man now, Daniel Kirkwood, and the observatory that was built in 1900, named for him, IU's Kirkwood Observatory. It remains a special part of our astronomical history and a part of our contemporary campus life here now. It's open for viewing, and it's nestled in a beautiful wooded area of our campus. I want to share just a little bit more. I said I wasn't going to move out of the 19th century, but we'll dip into the early 20th for this IU expedition to Spain in 1905, because the images are just so spectacular. The next generation of IU astronomers after Wylie and Kirkwood traveled to Spain to capture detailed photographs of the sun's corona during that year's total eclipse. The team consisted of IU astronomy professors John Miller and Wilbur Cogshaw, and those Cogshaw might be a name you're familiar with. 3 students went with them as well. They were using an innovative new motorized telescope to capture the sun without it blurring. And they were using additional cameras as well in an attempt, probably like many others, to capture observations during that brief window of time that might, in fact, show them that planet, Vulcan. It's easy to imagine the excitement this trip would have stirred in Professors Wylie and Kirkwood, who had both died 10 years earlier in 1895. That IU expedition team spent nearly a month on site preparing the cameras. One was 60 feet long, and it was enclosed in that tent you see there. Many of the instruments, like the one you see on the right, were taller than a person. The Indianapolis News helped to fund the trip and reported on it extensively. They reported that the instruments were shipped, and it took over a month for them to get there on a steamer. 18 packages were sent, weighing approximately 3,000 pounds in total. Quite an expedition. On the day of the eclipse, the weather was unfortunately cloudy, what we all hope it won't be on August 8th, right? And it interfered with the images. Nonetheless, one of the professors, Professor John Miller, wrote, The indescribable deep blue of the great clouds, bordered with what anyone but an eclipse observer would call a silver lining, was totally unlike anything I have ever seen and was strikingly beautiful. So going a little farther into the 20th century, and June 8th, 1918, there's an article here locally in the Bloomington Evening World. Dr. Cogshaw is now in Colorado taking photos of the eclipse, the article reads. So now I'm going to jump back into 1869 and share with you some of the local resources I stumbled upon in my research that are kind of fun. This eclipse, as I mentioned earlier, it was heralded as the greatest eclipse of the 19th century, and the press was having a great time with it, leading up to it, and then headlines in the days afters. It was, in fact, perhaps the world's first astronomical event marketed as popular entertainment. It wasn't just a pinnacle of excitement for the scientific community, but also a great celestial spectacle for lay people as well. There were reports that the smoked and stained glass was flying off store shelves, and just like now, unprecedented surges of tourism were being experienced by towns upon the path of the total eclipse. These examples of newspaper tidbits are from the town southwest of here, Evansville, and this from the Evansville Courier in 1869. Smoke your glass, it reads. And then up here on the top right, as the eclipse of 1869 will attract so many observers, it is well the unprofessional to know how brief will be the period of total obscuration. So in here below, it gives you the minutes and seconds for a total eclipse, and then the full coverage of the moon over the sun, so that you can be prepared. And waltz in to our next articles because they're pretty interesting. These are from the local newspaper here in Bloomington, the Bloomington Progress. And these are dated from July to August of 1869. And they're from the relatively mundane up there on the left. The Smithsonian Institute is sending a team. Teams are getting set up in Illinois. Below that, you'll see the beginning of a really long article that Theophilus Wylie wrote for the paper. And in fact, it was so popular. It was a description of exactly what would happen and the predictions of the dates over time and how the science worked. And he goes into really great detail for a community newspaper. And it's so popular that people locally ask for it to be printed again. And so it is. There's also some absurd that occurs. And these two tidbits on your right refer to that. The first reads, an inhabitant of the Salt Creek Hills came to town last Saturday, and having heard so much of the eclipse, he stopped in the courthouse yard, placed his eye to the tube of an octagonal structure, which at present lies upon its side in the northwest corner, and looked long and anxiously through what the rock beaters told him was a telescope, expecting momentarily to see the great obscuration. After wearying his patience and skinning his nose on against a nail, he left town, cursing the eclipse as an infernal Republican electioneering dodge. Well, the Republicans weren't the only ones in trouble. So this little article on the right was printed after the eclipse. And this one reads, a story was in circulation among the Democrats of Blackford County that the eclipse is a part of that's President Ulysses Grant, Reconstruction policy, gotten up for the purpose of making everybody look as much like a Negro as possible. As a consequence, they got their mat up high and were going around saying to each other, there, we told you we'd be amalgamationed if Grant was elected. So absurd and sad and evidence of conspiracy theories even at that time and relative to the eclipse. This is also fun, and I'll just put a few of these up here. The eclipse shows up in all sorts of titles after the eclipse. For the next year, local businesses begin naming themselves the Eclipse Stable, the Eclipse Livery, horses are named Eclipse and reported upon. So it'll be fun for us all to see in the next year or so what we might observe happening in naming practices. And finally, I'll just mention that the music that we've been playing throughout was recorded by one of our colleagues in the IU Jacobs School of Music, Dr. Gabe Lubell. And he and his colleagues will have a recital on August 7th here on campus. So if you're here in town, you'll get to hear their revised versions of these old tunes, plus some new music that they are composing for this eclipse. And I think it'll be a really fantastic and special occurrence. Well, and I'll also, maybe now is a good time to just refer back to the other presentations that are going to be coming up as well. You'll learn from these other presenters in this series about the wild animal behavior Theophilus refers to, right? And how to take photographs and how to take care of your eyes beyond smoked glass. So I want to thank you all for attending. And again, thank Vanessa and the IU College of Arts and Science for inviting me. And thanks to Kaya, who is going to jump on now and facilitate any questions that you may have for me.
So there are a couple questions. And so the first one is, in addition to astronomical references and diaries and letters, are there any Wylie objects related to astronomy on display at the museum?
Yes, and I referenced them, and I didn't show you any, did I? So we actually have here at Wylie House a couple of telescopes, one from each of the professors. So we have a telescope of Theophilus Wylie's, and we also have a telescope that was President Andrew Wylie's. In addition to the small telescope we purchased for an interpretation of Lizzie Breckenridge's interest. Theophilus Wylie also had a sextant, and we have that here as well. In addition to those, there are several astronomy books in the Wylie Library.
So the next question is from Patricia, and she asks, how far was Wylie House from the seminary building that could be seen from the Widow's Walk?
It looks a greater distance than, from the image, it actually looks a greater distance than it is. It's really just a few blocks. So maybe 3 blocks, I have to think about this, 3 blocks now, 2.5 to 3 blocks away, just east of here, or sorry, west of here. If you're from Bloomington, and again, I know not everyone is, but if you've been here and you're from Bloomington, now in that area, there's a post office and a Kroger and a Wendy's and a little green space in honor of the seminary called Seminary Square.
Okay, I think that is all of the Q&A questions that we have for tonight. So thank you so much, Carey. What an interesting presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you all. And if you want to know more, the links to the resources that I pulled from are there in the chat for you. Thanks all for spending some time with me.
Great. Thank you again so much for participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to personally thank Carey and Kaya for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support programs like tonight's presentation or other opportunities that connect alumni and friends with the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the IU Bloomington College Alumni Engagement Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. We hope to see you next time, but until then, please take care.